Hey guys, Uncommon Ramen here. Before we get into the video, let me remind you, if you like my content, please go ahead and hit that like button and subscribe button to get those analytics up. And consider hitting that bell icon if you'd like to be notified as my content comes out. Also, if you feel the need to support me, hit me up on my Patreon at patreon.com/uncommonramen, capital U, capital R. I do all of this in my free time, so any amount of support can help me bring more of this content to you more often. Okay, so today we're going to take a look at another deck tech. This is going to be Kwain Itinerant Meddler. Kwain is a group hug style deck. This particular deck is going to be a mixture of group hug with a small amount of pillow fort in it as well. For those of you who are watching this who do not understand the terms that I'm using, group hug is basically a mechanic that it's not a mechanic, but it is essentially anytime you do something that benefits you and someone else. So for instance, Scheming Symmetry, the black card that tutors, that allows one of your opponents to tutor as well, could be very well considered a group hug type card. So anytime you do something and one or more of your opponents also get to benefit from it, that is considered group hug. And then Pillow Fort is another term used to describe any type of thing you do to make it harder to attack you. Things like Silent Arbiter, Crawl Space, Ensnaring Bridge, Propaganda, Ghostly Prison, stuff like that are considered Pillow Fort type cards because you are basically hiding behind, I guess, attacks, if you will, so that your opponents can't hurt you. So this is what this deck is going to be like, and I'll go into greater detail as we get into specific cards. So first, let's take a look at our commander, which is going to be Kwain the Itinerant Meddler. He is 1 white and 1 blue to cast. He is a 1/3. You can tap him to have each player draw a card, and then each player who draws a card this way also gains a life. Now, the big thing here is that it's a you may ability, so your opponents can choose not to draw a card. And this goes exactly with the theme of Group Hug, where we're not just drawing a card ourselves and gaining a life. Each opponent has the opportunity to do so as well. So it's a show of good faith that is hiding the fact that this deck is trying to win through alternative means, either by decking out your opponents or finding ways to alternatively win on our side. So this is Kwain the Itinerant Meddler. Next, we're going to take a look at our creatures. Okay, starting with Body of Knowledge. Body of Knowledge is 3 and 2 blue for a star. Body of Knowledge's power and toughness are each equal to the number of cards in your hand, and you have no maximum hand size. Whenever Body of Knowledge is dealt damage, draw that many cards. So, as I mentioned before, we're trying to find alternative win conditions here. We are not going to be doing a lot in the way of attacking our opponents unless we're forced into a corner. A lot of the times, the big creatures that we're going to be putting in play are really meant to be there as deterrents for your opponents to attack you, especially as you start setting up the Pillow Fort. So, Body of Knowledge has a chance to get very large. It negates your hand size, which means that you can keep as many cards in your hand as you'd like at the end of each turn. And then every time it takes damage, you're going to draw that many cards. So if your opponent doesn't kill it when it takes damage, you're just going to get a whole bunch more cards to add into your hand. So it plays into the theme of trying to get our answers, or I should say our alternative win conditions, as quickly as possible. Next up, we have Chasm Stalker. This is 2 and a blue for a 1/1. Whenever you draw a card, put a +1/+1 counter on Chasm Stalker. When Chasm Stalker dies, create X 1/1 blue squid creature tokens with Island Walk, where X is the number of +1/+1 counters on Chasm Stalker. He is a 1/1. So, again, what we're trying to do here is draw a whole bunch of cards, and this guy really benefits from drawing those cards. So every time you draw a card, you're going to put a +1/+1 counter on him, which is going to make him relatively big relatively quickly. And again, we're not using him to attack so much unless we're backed into a corner. Really what we're doing is deterring our opponents from attacking us. More importantly, if it dies, it turns into a huge amount of little 1/1 squids. And again, these 1/1 squids, they have island walks, so they can be used to swing wide on a player, but really they are also chump blockers, capable of soaking up non-trample damage. Next up, we have Consecrated Sphinx. This is 4 and 2 blue for a 4/6 flying. Whenever an opponent draws a card, you may draw 2 cards. So again, we're doing Group Hug. We're going to make our opponents, maybe not make them, but we are going to be putting out there the opportunity to draw more than 1 card per turn, not just for yourself, but also for your opponents. Consecrated Sphinx just makes sure that you get the edge on all the card draw. Next up, we have Drum Bellower. Drum Bellower is 2 and a white. It's a 2/1 flying. Untap all creatures you control during each other player's untap step. So this is a great way to allow you to become a little aggressive if necessary. If you get put into a corner, it allows you to attack with those big creatures, and then at the end step, you get to untap all of them and use them as a wall either way. Next up, we have Esper Sentinel. This is 1 white for a 1/1. Whenever an opponent casts their first non-creature spell each turn, draw a card unless that player pays X, where X is Esper Sentinel's power. This is just a great way to draw some cards. This is very similar to Ristic Study, only you can only do it once per opponent's turn. Next up, we have Flump. It's 1 and a white for a 0/4 defender with flying. Whenever Flump is dealt damage, you and target opponent each draw a card. This is really cool because, again, it plays to that Group Hug theme where we're not the only ones who are going to draw cards. If he takes damage, both you and an opponent are going to draw cards, and it really puts out that goodwill feeling. Next up, we have Kami of the Crescent Moon, 2 blue for a 1/3. At the beginning of each player's draw step, that player draws an additional card. So we're going to be drawing 2 cards instead of 1 each turn, and it includes yourself. And again, it has that Group Hug theme to it. Next up, we have Laboratory Maniac. This is 2 and a blue for a 2/2. If you would draw a card while your library has no cards in it, you win the game instead. So this is an alternative win condition for us, and again, the idea is if we can't get some of our other win conditions, to basically deck ourselves and then use this to win the game. Next up, we have Nadir Kraken. This is 1 and 2 blue for a 2/3. Whenever you draw a card, you may pay 1. If you do, put a +1/+1 counter on Nadir Kraken and create a 1/1 blue tentacle creature token. So this is very similar to the Chasm Stalker, except that instead of it having to die to create a whole bunch of little 1/1s, you just have to pay 1 each time you draw a card. So not only does it make Nadir Kraken much bigger, creating a very large deferent type creature for your opponent's attacks, but it also creates a whole bunch of 1/1s that you can use for chump blocking. Next up, we have Nezahal, Primal Tithe, 5 and 2 blue for a 7/7. It cannot be countered. You have no maximum hand size. Whenever an opponent casts a non-creature spell, you get to draw a card, and discard 3 cards, exile Nezahal Primal Tithe, return it to the battlefield tapped under its owner's control at the beginning of the next end step. So this has a bunch of really cool text here. First off, you don't have a maximum hand size, so this is going to be a redundant thing that you're going to see throughout the course of this deck. There's a ton of cards in here that negate your hand size. Whenever an opponent casts a non-creature spell, you get to draw a card. So this is very similar to Ristic, except Ristic Study looks for any spell being cast, and you can pay 2 to stop it from happening, whereas this, you just outright get to draw. And then finally, you can discard 3 cards to exile Nezahal Primal Tithe and return to the battlefield tapped under your control at the beginning of the next end step. So Nezahal has a built-in way to protect itself. And I'm going to be honest with you, I've played this deck a couple of times. You are going to end up with so many cards in your hand and so many things that you just don't absolutely need at the time. There is no reason you won't be able to find at least 3 cards to discard. And even maybe multiple times. Nezahal's built-in draw card engine also pads your hand as well, so it's just a really fantastic card in here. Next up, we have Psychosis Crawler. This is 5 for a star. Psychosis Crawler's power and toughness are each equal to the number of cards in your hand. Whenever you draw a card, each opponent loses 1 life. So this is another way to alternatively win. As I mentioned, we are going to be drawing a huge amount of cards. We've already seen the Consecrated Sphinx. We've already seen the Kami of the Crescent Moon. There are still tons more to come up. So we're going to be dealing a lot of damage if this is in play. Not to mention, the more cards you have in your hand, the bigger this gets, so it becomes a deterrent to your opponents to attack you. Next up, we have Shabraz the Sky Shark. This is 3, a white and a blue for a 3/3 partner with Braylon, Sky Shark Rider. That person is not in this deck because I think he's red. Flying, whenever you draw a card, put a +1/+1 counter on Shabraz the Sky Shark, and you gain a life. And then for 1 white or blue, target human gains flying until end of turn. So the last part of this, I don't even think there is a human in here, so you're not really going to play the last part of this. But this middle text here, whenever you draw a card, put a +1/+1 counter on Shabraz and gain a life. So you're going to, like I said, be drawing a ton of cards. This is a fantastic way to make a huge flyer that, with the Drum Bellower, will untap every end step of yours, and you gain life every time you draw a card. So it's also a great way to pad your life total. Next up, we have Silent Arbiter. I already talked about this being a great Pillow Fort card. This is 4 for a 1/5. No more than 1 creature can attack each combat, and no more than 1 creature can block each combat. So this is really fantastic with all the big creatures that we potentially will have in this deck, because it makes it really, really, really difficult for your opponents to swing in at you. Next up, we have Thassa's Oracle. This is 2 blue for a 1/3. When Thassa's Oracle enters the battlefield, look at the top X cards of your library, where X is your devotion to blue. Put 1 of them on top of your library, and the rest on the bottom of your library in a random order. If X is greater than or equal to the number of cards in your library, you win the game. So this is very much similar to the Laboratory Maniac, except it gives you a little bit of flexibility. Laboratory Maniac requires you to have no cards left in your library, whereas Thassa, it just depends on how much your devotion to blue is. Thassa's Oracle, my bad. So this is a fantastic, flexible, alternative win condition. Next up, we have Titled Barracuda. This is 3 and a blue for a 3/4. Any player may cast spells as though they had flash, and your opponents can't cast spells during your turn. So the beauty of this is that it has a very group hug feel to it, because it allows the opponents to cast spells during their turn or during other opponents' turns as though they had flash. But it also helps to keep you protected by making sure your opponents cannot cast spells during your turn, which means that if they want to kill things, or kill it specifically, they have to do it during their turn. Or during their collective turns, I should say. Next up, we have Triskaidek File. This is 1 and a blue for a 1/3. You have no maximum hand size. At the beginning of your upkeep, if you have exactly 13 cards in your hand, you win the game. And for 3 and a blue, you get to draw a card. So this is a beautiful alternative win condition here. First off, we have the redundancy of no maximum hand size. We also have the alternative win condition here, which is at the beginning of your upkeep, if you have exactly 13 cards in your hand, you win the game. That is surprisingly not as hard as it seems in this deck. So it's something you can definitely aim for. And then it also has a built-in draw card ability on it. So for 3 and a blue, you get to draw a card. So if you are actually really in dire straits, you don't even have to use this for its win condition. You could just play it if you need to draw cards. Lastly on this, we have Win-Bourne Muse. This is 3 and a white for a 2/3 flying. Creatures can't attack you unless their controller pays 2 for each creature he or she controls that's attacking you. So this is, again, classic Pillow Fort. We put this down to make it more difficult for your opponent to attack you, and especially more difficult for your opponent to attack you with multiple creatures. Okay, next up we are going to take a look at instants. Alright. Starting with Aetherize. This is 3 and a blue. Return all attacking creatures to their owner's hand. So this is another one of those if you're in dire situations and your opponents have caught on to what you're doing and they need you dead, this is a great way to protect yourself. Next up, we have an offer you can't refuse. This is 1 blue, counter target non-creature spell. Its controller creates 2 treasure tokens. So again, we're kind of doing a mix of the group hug feel here, because we're giving the opponent 2 treasures after we counter their spell, but we are probably countering something that is well worth more than 2 treasures. But the idea here is that we're giving a show of goodwill. Next up, we have Arcane Denial. Arcane Denial is 1 and a blue. Counter target spell, its controller may draw up to 2 cards at the beginning of the next turn's upkeep, and you draw a card at the beginning of next turn's upkeep. So not only are we countering a spell, but we're also getting our opponents to draw cards, which is exactly what we want them to do. We're also getting to draw cards ourselves. So again, we're just playing to this idea of drawing a lot of cards. Next up, we have Brainstorm. This is 1 blue. Draw 3 cards, then put 2 cards from your hand on top of your library in any order. Really important here, if you don't know, especially if you're newer, the 2 cards that you put from your hand on top of your library do not have to be any of the 3 cards that you drew. It just has to be 2 cards from your hand. Beautiful card. Next up, we have Counterspell. This is 2 blue to counter target spell. Very classic, very easy, very efficient. Next up, we have Cyclonic Rift. This is 1 and a blue, return target non-land permanent you don't control to its owner's hand, and you can overload it for 6 and a blue. Overloading basically replaces all instances of target with each. So if you overload it for 6 and a blue, you return all non-land permanents you don't control to their owner's hand. This can potentially shut out a game. It can be a win condition on its own. Doing this with a really massive board state, things like Body of Knowledge, Ominous Seas, Chasm Stalker, stuff like that, you could easily take out your opponents doing that. Next up, we have Dovan's Veto, 1 blue and 1 white. This spell can't be countered, and you counter target non-creature spell. Very simple, very efficient. Next up, we have Generous Gift, 2 and a white, destroy target permanent. Its controller creates a 3/3 green elephant creature token. Again, that 3/3 green elephant creature token is going to be a lot less scary than whatever permanent you just destroyed. Then we have Negate, 1 and a blue, counter target non-creature spell. Pretty simple. Then we have Path to Exile. This is 1 white. You get to exile target creature, and its opponent may search their library for a basic land card, put that card onto the battlefield tapped. Next up, we have Swords to Plowshares. This is 1 white. Exile target creature, its controller gains life equal to its power. Next up, we have Teferi's Protection, 2 and a white. Until your next turn, your life total can't change, and you gain protection from everything. All permanents you control phase out. Exile Teferi's Protection. This is up there with Aetherize. It's in here to protect you from just downright massacre. If every opponent on the table has decided you are the threat, this is a fantastic way to keep yourself alive. This is also a great way to guarantee your Triskai Decaphile goes off. If you have 14 cards in your hand, you play the Teferi's Protection, you're out of the game until it comes to your turn, and by the time it comes to your turn, everything comes back and you win the game. Finally, we have Vision Skeins, or Vision Skynes, I don't know how to pronounce that. It is 1 and a blue, each player draws 2 cards. Again, group hug. It's not just about us drawing cards, it's about everybody at the table drawing cards, and that gives a good, happy feeling to everybody, and they want to leave you alive. Next up, we're going to take a look at Sorceries. First off, we have Approach of the Second Sun, another alternative win condition in here. It is 6 and a white. If this spell was cast from your hand and you've cast another spell named Approach of the Second Sun this game, you win the game. Otherwise, put Approach of the Second Sun into the owner's library, 7th from the top, and you gain 7 life. So if you cast this spell twice from your hand, you win. Just outright. That's it. Game over. Then we have Farewell. 4 and 2 white. Choose one or more. Exile all artifacts. Exile all creatures. Exile all enchantments. Exile all graveyards. This is probably one of the best board wipes in existence, I would say. I'm fairly confident to say this is one of the best board wipes, because this also hits indestructible cards and is just downright a mean board wipe. Next up, we have Minds Aglow. 1 blue, join forces. Starting with you, each player may pay any amount of mana. Each player draws X cards, where X is the total amount of mana paid this way. So again, join forces and tempt cards are good examples of group hug theme. In this case, you can spend any amount of mana, even if your opponents don't spend any mana at all, and force everyone to draw X cards, where X is equal to the mana you spent. You don't draw cards equal to the amount of mana you spent, so if your opponent spends 0 mana, they're not going to not draw cards, they're just going to draw less cards than they would if they had spent mana. So all around, this card is very good for this deck. Next up, we have Prosperity. X and a blue, each player draws X cards. So where Minds Aglow, essentially, this is exactly the same thing as Minds Aglow, except Minds Aglow allows your opponents to pay into it, whereas Prosperity only allows you to. Next up, we have Secret Rendezvous. 1 and 2 white. You and target opponent each draw 3 cards. Again, group hug. Next up, we have Supreme Verdict. 1, 2 white, and a blue. Supreme Verdict cannot be countered. Destroy all creatures. Next up, we have Time Wipe. This is 2 white, and a blue. Return a creature you control to its owner's hand, and then destroy all creatures. And I believe, finally, we have Windfall. 2 and a blue. Each player discards his or her hand, and draws cards equal to the greatest number a player discarded this way. So this is really great in this deck too, especially if we're going for the idea of decking out our opponents. If you have a huge amount of cards in your hand, you can play this to force your opponents to draw a huge number of cards from their deck. And if they don't have ways to negate their hand size, they're going to have to discard down, and it does bring them closer and closer to not having cards in their library. All right, next up, we're going to take a look at artifacts. I'm actually surprised at how many are in here. Okay, first off, we have Alhamrit's Archive. 5 for a, if you would gain life, you gain twice that much life instead, and if you would draw a card except for the first one you draw each of your draw steps, draw 2 cards instead. So we're going to double down on our draws to help us get through our deck so that we can hit our Labman or Thassa's Oracle win conditions, or to help us dig deeper for the approach of the second sun. We also gain twice as much life when we gain life, so it helps us to pad our life total, because eventually your opponents are going to catch on to what you're doing, and they will try and kill you. Next up, we have Arcane Cygnet, a rock for 2. You can tap it to add 1 mana of your commander's color identity. We have Azorius Signet, a rock for 2. You can tap 1 and it to add Azorius colors. We have Commander Sphere, a rock for 3. You can tap it to add 1 mana of your commander's color identity, or you can sacrifice it to draw a card. Well, I guess you could do that as well, but needless to say. Next up, we have Folio of Fancies. This is 1 and a blue. Players have no maximum hand size, so you can outright make sure your opponents have no maximum hand size, and there is a benefit to it, because if they have no maximum hand size, you can actually pay 2 and a blue and tap Folio of Fancies, and each opponent puts a number of cards equal to the number of cards in their hand from the top of their library into their graveyard. So the more and more we're forcing them to draw, the more and more deadly Folio of Fancy becomes as we get through the game. More importantly, you can pay twice X and this to have each player draw X cards. So it's got a built-in way to draw cards, and it doesn't say you draw cards, it says each player, so it's group hug. Next up, we have Font of Mythos. This is 4. At the beginning of each player's draw step, that player draws 2 additional cards. Again, we're just trying to force them to draw extra cards. Next up, we have Howling Mine. This is 2 at the beginning of each player's draw step. If Howling Mine is untapped, that player draws an additional card. So it's a half-size Font of Mythos, a fun-size Font of Mythos. Next up, we have Mindstone. This is a rock for 2. You can tap it to add colorless, or you can tap 1 and it to sacrifice it and draw a card. Next up, we have Soul Ring. This is 1. You can tap it to add 2 colorless, or generic, whatever. Next up, we have Temple Bell. This is 3. You can tap it to have each player draw a card. Again, we're just going for that group hug theme. Next, we have Thought Vessel. This is a rock for 2. You have no maximum hand size, and you can tap to add 1 colorless mana to your mana pool. Next up, we have Venzers Journal. This is 5. You have no maximum hand size. At the beginning of your upkeep, you gain 1 life for each card in your hand. This is a phenomenal way to recover life total and also just pad your life total. It makes it very difficult for your opponents to kill you. More importantly, if you've set up your pillow fort and your opponents haven't found a way to get rid of anything in it, it makes it extremely difficult to kill you. Next up, we have Wedding Ring. This is 2 and 2 white for a very cheeky artifact that says, whenever Wedding Ring enters the battlefield, if it was cast, target opponent creates a token that's a copy of it. Whenever an opponent who controls an artifact named Wedding Ring draws a card during their turn, you draw a card. And whenever an opponent who controls an artifact named Wedding Ring gains a life during your turn, you gain that much life. So, the beauty of this card is that you get to choose someone at the table to pretty much forever group hug until they destroy the Wedding Ring, or they destroy your Wedding Ring, or whatever ends up happening. And essentially, anytime they draw a card, you draw a card, and anytime you draw a card, they draw a card. It's not infinite, for the record. It doesn't loop. And then whenever an opponent who controls an artifact named Wedding Ring gains life, you gain that much life as well. So if you're playing somebody who's extorting, or just playing a life gain deck in general, this is a really, really awesome way to pad your life total incredibly. Okay, finally, we have Well of Knowledge. This is 3. Any player may pay 2 during his or her draw phase to draw a card. Players may use this ability as many times as they choose. So this is a subtle, sneaky way to give your opponents an opportunity to draw way more cards than they would normally draw, as long as they are willing to pay 2 for each card that they draw. It gives them an option, it does not force them. That's the one downside, but it is a very cool and very subtle card. Alright, next up we're going to take a look at enchantments. Alright, starting with Dictate of Crufix. This is 1 and 2 blue. It has flash. At the beginning of each player's draw step, that player draws an additional card. It's an enchantment, so it sticks, and it does exactly what we're trying to do, which is basically just make sure that during our draw step, we're drawing as many cards as possible. Next up, we have Ghostly Prison. This is 2 and a white. Creatures can't attack you unless their controller pays 2 for each creature they control that's attacking you. Again, we're just building that pillow fort. Next, we have Ominous Seas. Whenever you draw a card, you put a Foreshadow counter on Ominous Seas, and you can remove 8 Foreshadow counters from Ominous Seas to create an 8/8 blue Kraken creature token. So again, this is one of those ways where you can create a huge amount of large creatures and then use them as a wall to keep you protected, or with the right opportunity, swing in and really cause some chaos. Next up, we have Propaganda. 2 and a blue. Creatures can't attack you unless their controller pays 2 for each creature they control that's attacking you. Is the exact same thing as Ghostly Prison, except in blue. Next up, we have Psychic Corrosion. This is 2 and a blue. Whenever you draw a card, each opponent puts the top 2 cards of their library into their graveyard. So we are spending our game trying to draw a lot of cards. This way we can also punish our opponents, and since we are trying to deck them through drawing cards, this is a fantastic way to speed up that process by making them mill cards as well, and it just forces your opponents to really pay attention. Next up, we have Ristic Study. This is 2 and a blue. Whenever an opponent plays a spell, you may draw a card unless that player pays 1. So if they don't pay 1, you get to draw cards. This can get very out of hand. If you've ever watched I Hate Your Deck, or you've ever watched Command Zone, or any of these places that have these, you can see how not paying for this can get really, really scary really fast. But it is advisable that you just pay the 1, because allowing your opponent to draw cards is a bad idea. Next up, we have Smothering Tithe. This is 3 and a white. Whenever an opponent draws a card, that player may pay 2. If that player doesn't, you get to create a treasure token. We're going to be spending a huge amount of time forcing our opponents to draw huge amounts of cards. They're not always going to be able to pay this tax, which means you're going to benefit from a huge amount of treasures, no matter how much they try and stop you. Next up, we have Sphere of Safety. 4 and a white. Creatures can't attack you or a planeswalker you control unless their controller pays X for each of those creatures, where X is the number of enchantments you control. This is the mother of all Pillow Fort cards. This right here, with several enchantments, becomes very difficult to attack through. Next up, we have Teferi's Ageless Insight. This is 2 and 2 blue. If you would draw a card except the first one you draw in each of your draw steps, you draw 2 cards instead. So again, doubling down on our draw cards. This unfortunately does not apply to your opponents. Next, we have Well of Ideas. This is 5 and a blue. When Well of Ideas enters the battlefield, you get to draw 2 cards. At the beginning of each other player's draw step, that player draws an additional card. And at the beginning of your draw step, you draw 2 additional cards. So we're drawing extra cards for ourselves, so we can really get close to that alternative win condition with Thassa and Labman, and Jace for that matter. And we're also forcing our opponents to draw more cards, so we're getting closer to our goal to decking them. And when it enters the battlefield, we get to draw 2 cards. There's very little downside to this. Finally, we have Wizard class. This is 1 blue. For 1 blue, you have no maximum hand size. You can level it up by paying 2 and a blue. When this class becomes level 2, you get to draw 2 cards. And then you can level it again for 4 and a blue. When it hits level 3, you get whenever you draw a card, put a +1/+1 counter on target creature you control. So this is a really scary way to build a board state that makes it really hard for your opponents to attack through, or just makes it so deadly that you can attack and take out your opponents. All right, next up, we're going to take a look at Planeswalkers. There are 2 of them. The first one is Jace, Wielder of Mysteries. This is 1 and 3 blue. If you would draw a card while your library has no cards in it, you win the game instead. So it's just a passive way to win the game. Its +1 is target player puts the top 2 cards of their library into their graveyard, and then you get to draw a card. So again, we're milling our opponents and drawing cards for ourselves. And then for -8, you get to draw 7 cards, and if your library has no cards in it, you win the game. So another way to just win the game if you have no cards in your library. And the last card we're looking at here, or last Planeswalker we're looking at here, is Narset, Parter of Veils. This is 1 and 2 blue. Each opponent can't draw more than 1 card each turn. So if, for whatever reason, and this is definitely a last resort type thing. Oh, I'm sorry, I forgot to tell you. It's -2 is look at the top 4 cards of your library. You may reveal a non-creature, non-land card from among them and put it into your hand. Put the rest on the bottom of your library in a random order. You shouldn't need to use that, but if it's absolutely 100% necessary, then you can use it. But really what it is here for is to make sure your opponents don't draw more than 1 card per turn. This is an absolute last resort. So this is if your Pillow Fort got destroyed. If your all of your enchantments that make your opponents draw cards got destroyed, or we're getting to the late game and it doesn't look like your ability to get your deck empty is going to work out. So Thassa's and Jace and Labman are not an option, or your life total is getting very low and it's time to start becoming aggressive. This is a way to turn off your opponent's ability to draw off the cards that normally they would be able to draw off, so you can focus specifically on just drawing cards yourself. So, fantastic card. All right, we're going to take a look at non-basic lands. All right, we got Azorius Chancery. This is the bounce land for blue-white. We have Command Tower, taps to add 1 mana of your commander's color identity. We have Deserted Beach, a check land for blue-white. We have Glacial Fortress, another check land for blue-white. We have Hallowed Fountain, a shock land for blue-white. We have Irrigated Farmland. It is a bicycle land for blue-white. We have Mikokoro, Center of the Sea. This one can tap for colorless, or you can tap 2 and it to have each player draw a card, so another way to just group hug. Mystic Sanctuary enters the battlefield tapped unless you control 3 or more other islands, and whenever Mystic Sanctuary enters the battlefield untapped, you may return target instant or you may put target instant or sorcery card from your graveyard on top of your library. We have Nimbus Maze. You can tap it for colorless, you can tap it for white if you control an island, and you can tap it for blue if you control plains. Next up we have Port Town. This comes into play tapped unless you reveal an island or plains card from your hand. Prairie Stream enters the battlefield tapped unless you control 2 or more basic lands. Reliquary Tower. You have no maximum hand size, taps for colorless. Sea of Clouds enters the battlefield tapped unless you have 2 or more opponents, so it's the blue-white Crowdland. And last but not least, we have Temple of Enlightenment, the blue-white Scryland. And then finally, the basic lands, we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13 islands. And 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 plains. So that is the Kwain Itinerant Meddler group hug low-key pillow fort deck. Right there. This is Azorius Colors. And that is it, guys. If you have any questions or comments, leave those down below. But let's keep it positive. I will be removing any negative comments. And guys, until next time, peace.